Jacqueline, thank you for joining us. You have so much to share with us, and we just have 1 hour to try to do as much as we can. So we'll start right away. Let's begin today, Jacqueline, with you telling us what you can about your family in your own early years before the Anschluss, which is when Hitler annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938, knowing in that time you were very young, so you don't have personal memories of most of that. But tell us what you've learned and what you know about that period, about your family.
All I know is that when I was 3 years old and there was the Anschluss and the Czechoslovakia, my parents got scared and we left Paris and we went to a little town called Saint-Paul, but I really don't know. And then we went back to Paris, and I really don't have any memories of that.
Tell us about your parents' nationalities, because that had some significance. Tell us about it.
Yeah, my mother was born in Hamburg, Germany, so she was a German Jew. And my father was a Dutch, and he was born in, for centuries, the family Mendels was in Almelo, a little town, or, well, relatively little town in the northeast of Holland. And there are, in the cemetery, there are many tombs of Mendels family. And when my father married my mother, or when my mother married my father, she became Dutch by marriage.
How large was your extended family?
Well, on my mother was an only child. She had cousins who later on we can talk about that if we have time. Were on a kinder transport, were able to go to England. So she had 4 cousins, but otherwise she was an only child. Her parents were. Her father died, and by the way, my name Jacqueline is because my grandfather was called Jacob, and my parents were so hoping for a boy because they had a girl, my big sister, and they saw I was going to be the French equivalent of Jacob. It was going to be Jacques, and here I come, I'm a girl, so Jacqueline. So it's after my grandfather.
I hadn't heard that before. Okay, you had
my family on my father. On my father's side was quite extended, and they were all murdered. Everybody
in the extended family. Jacqueline, you had mentioned to me that during that period, your father's business was not doing well. Can you say a little bit about that?
France had a depression, just like America, actually, and things were hard. My father was a businessman importing, exporting specialty foods. But if I can go ahead of myself, after the Germans invaded Paris and there were all kinds of laws against the Jews, he was not allowed to keep his business. He had to give it away to his associate, who fortunately was a good man.
And I hope we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later.
Yeah.
Absolutely. As you mentioned, after the Anschluss, your parents left Paris for a little while and returned. Tell us what you can about that period for the family and what happened with you and your family during the period right before Germany invaded Poland and war began in September 1939, so between the Anschluss and the beginning of the war.
I was too young.
Too young.
When the Germans invaded, I was 4 years old, so all I know is that I was terribly afraid of the Germans.
You had mentioned, and you wrote about it in your book, that when they fled, they took you to Fontainebleau, I think. Was there a reason for going there, to your knowledge? Have you been able to learn that?
Probably there was a second time that we left. That was before the Germans invaded Luxembourg and Belgium and Holland and France. So there was a period that was very difficult, and we went probably around Fontainebleau. I really
don't know
can't
the
say,
details.
no.
Yeah. In March 1939, your parents had you and Manuela declared French citizens. Tell us why that was significant.
That's a big story.
Yeah.
We were born in Paris, of Dutch parents, and my father went to la mairie, the city hall, to have us declared French, which was accepted. But after Pétain and Hitler signed the armistice, anybody like my sister and me, who had been in a way naturalized French according to the laws and according to a law of 1927, we lost it. So we were foreign Jews. We lost our French citizenship and we became Dutch Jews, which were the first to be deported. We were not French anymore.
You're not French anymore,
No.
so, but you're at that point in 1939, your parents wanted to make sure that you were officially and in every way considered French citizens.
Yeah, but it didn't last.
It didn't
And I
last.
know later on when we crossed the demarcation line that my father took that piece of paper, which I have on the wall, and I can see it was folded in four, and my father was hoping that the two daughters, my sister and me, would be declared French and wouldn't be deported immediately. Well, anyway.
You had also shared with me that in the year that the war began, but before it began in September 39, your family were able to take a couple of trips. I think they went to see your mother's family in Hamburg, as well as took a trip to Holland during that pre-war period.
That was in 1937. I have
37.
Photos of that that were kept, but I don't remember.
Okay. Jacqueline, after war broke out, your family left Paris for a second time, but returned after a short period. In the following spring, of course, in May of 1940s, when Germany attacked Belgium and Holland, and then, of course, they invaded France in June of 1940. When they invaded France, your family fled Paris for a third time, but you again returned to Paris. Tell us why you think your parents several times left Paris but only returned to Paris. And in this particular case, when they returned, now the Germans were there. What motivated them to return to Paris, and then what was life like for them when they came back after that third time?
Oh, well, the third time was the big time. It was called, in French, it's called Exode, the Exodus. And my father got a little car from his office, where he was still in charge. And I remember I had my doll, and my sister had her doll, and we traveled until I guess there was no more gasoline in the car, and we stopped in a little town called Celles-sur-Belle, and my father knocked at the door and said, could we spend the night? And actually we spent 3 weeks there. They were wonderful people, and we were 4 girls. I have a photo of them. I was the youngest of the 4, and we spent time. They gave us their room and their dining room, and they were absolutely, and then they never accepted any money. And finally, when France was occupied, my father said, well, I have to earn a living, and we went back to Paris. And a lot of the Jews never went back to Paris at that time because the Germans were all over in the northern part of France. Yeah.
But for your father, it really was, that's where my business is, and that's for your father, it was because his business was there.
Yes.
For business reasons, yeah.
Right.
You, in the Exodus, as you referred to it, it was really hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Parisians were fleeing all at the same time.
Not only Parisians, people came all the way from Belgium because Belgium was occupied, and people were walking. One of our survivors there, Albert, that you know, told me how they didn't have the use of a car or a truck or a van, and they were walking, and his grandmother was shot and died right there while they were walking. We were very lucky.
You were very lucky. Yeah, I hope we get a chance to talk about that too a little bit later. At one point, your parents, I think, considered trying to leave for a Dutch colony, but they didn't do that.
Right.
What was behind that?
Well, apparently my father thought that Curacao, which was a Dutch colony, would take in Dutch Jews. And the Queen of Holland, Queen Wilhelmina, at that time, had said that she was going to help people that were in distress, Dutch people in distress. And actually, I did a lot of research on that, and it's not true. She was not. But something I just found now by somebody whose family survived in Shanghai, that there was a Chinese man, a wonderful man, that was making fake visas for people to go to Curacao. So everything I'm telling you is such a long story. My grandmother in Hamburg was thinking of going east to Shanghai, and if there had been a miracle for her, she would have done that, and she would have ended up maybe in Curacao. But of course, all that never happened. It's like a story, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
You and even though you were so young, you and your sister do have some memories of the German attack on Paris.
Yes.
But tell us a little bit about that.
Well, all I know is that I was so afraid of the Germans. Mm-hmm. And there were Germans upstairs from us. We lived on the first floor, French first floor, which is second floor America. And they were upstairs taking over. They took over a family of a Jewish family that had escaped. And so we had Germans upstairs from us, and my mother was doing an errand. Jews were only allowed to go shopping between 5 and 7 p.m. And when my mother, and she said, "Don't open the door." And there was a ring at the bell, and there, me, a little curious, I'm still curious today, opened the door, and then I see booths like that. You know, I was little, and there were booths, and they were the Germans, and I don't know whether they were the ones that lived there or whether they were friends. I have no idea, but they closed the door. And at that time, we were not wearing our Jewish star yet.
That hadn't happened.
Which was fortunate, of course. And when I told my mother when she came back, I was severely punished, of course.
Mm-hmm. You returned to Paris, and then you continued living in Paris until the summer of 1942, when your parents arranged for the four of you to leave Paris for Vichy, or Free France. Tell us about the events that led up to your parents' decision that it was time to leave Paris for good, or at least at that time, and how you found yourself, after that decision, in this village of Lugat.
Oh, that's a very, very long story.
That's a long story.
Yes. My parents' friends in Saint-Mandé, where we live, which is near the zoo, and I love the zoo, but we were not allowed to go to the zoo anymore. I love the monkeys. Anyway, in Saint-Mandé.
And that was part of the restrictions, Jews not allowed
no,
to go to the zoo.
we're not allowed anything. We were not allowed to go to the library. We were not allowed to take books out. We were not allowed. My father lost his business. Mm-hmm. My sister was learning to swim. She was not allowed to go to the swimming pool. Everything was forbidden for the Jews. We were not allowed to go to those little parks, which are called square in French. It was forbidden for, let's see, how does it go? It was forbidden for blacks, for dogs, and for Jews, in that order.
In that order.
Yeah. And we were learning to ride our bikes, and we were not allowed to go to that little park next to that. But yeah, my parents' friends said, "You can't stay in Paris. It's too dangerous for you." They were arresting people starting in 1941, and they said, "You have to leave." And my father, through the Dutch club, where he was a member, found two, what he hoped were reliable passeurs, which means smugglers.
Smugglers.
And for a fee, and I don't know where he got the money because he didn't have a job anymore, to offer to get us through the demarcation line. In the meantime, in July 16 and 17, 42, was that infamous rafle du... la rafle d'hiver du, what's it called? I'm missing that word. Anyway, when they rounded up le Veldiv, la rafle du Veldiv, where they rounded up 13,000 Jews, mostly from an area in Paris where there was a higher concentration. We didn't live in a Jewish neighborhood. There were Jews, of course, but not a high percentage. And what I should say also is that my father wanted to obey the law. And when it was declared that the Jews had to register at the city hall, at the mairie, he said, well, we'll do what they want and they will leave us alone. Well, fat chance. And so we were registered. We were registered. And there were some good policemen, because that was the French police that rounded up the Jews. They were supposed to round up 27,000 Jews in Paris. But fortunately, and thanks to some good police, people were told, don't sleep in your apartment tonight because they're coming to round you up next morning at 5 a.m. And so people changed or moved to some nice Catholic neighbors. France is a Catholic country, as you know, I'm sure. So that's why 13,000 Jews instead of 27, but there were 4,000 children and living in terrible conditions. There is a documentary that was made, La Rafle, the roundup, about that story, and some people managed to escape. They were rounded up in buses. Some people threw themselves out of the window and died because they knew something horrible was happening. And there we were. They forgot to ring our bell that day. They forgot to ring our bell. They rang our bell to get us 1 week after we escaped.
You were gone.
So that was the 31st of, so that was the roundup was 16th, 17th of July, 42, which was very late in the war. Right. And the Germans were all over. You hear me use the word German. For me, the word Nazi didn't exist. It was les Allemands, les Boches. In French, it's like that. And the word Nazi, I heard it way after the war. It didn't exist. So anyway, those wonderful friends of my parents, they come and spend the last night with us. And the man of the house, they lived near the metro, Saint-Mandé-Tourelle, and they said it will be very easy for you tomorrow morning to catch the first metro. Jews were allowed at 6 a.m. in the last train of the metro. And so we went. Maurice was his name, Maurice Paris, took our Jewish stars and burned them. So we didn't, but my parents had ID cards and it said Juif. So if the police came and asked for vos papiers, s'il vous plaît, your papers, that would have been it. But like many, many, many miracles that I talk about and wrote about, that morning when we left, there was no police asking for vos papiers, s'il vous plaît. And I'm wearing something that Madame Paris gave me. I took it this morning. And if anybody is Catholic here, you will know Notre-Dame de Lourdes. That's in the south of France, near the Pier. I don't know, is anybody Catholic
Lourdes,
here?
yeah.
No, nobody. Yes,
yeah.
You're Catholic. So you know about Lourdes. And there was a woman, I forget her name, but a Soubirou in the 19th century who had been saved. And so Madame Paris, her name was Geneviève, gave a medal to my sister and my mother, I don't know what, and to me. And mine is really, it's quite old, and it says Notre-Dame de Lourdes. And she said, that will help you.
And you've held
And I have it to this day.
to this day. And your sister has hers, is that
Yes,
right?
yeah, but hers is not as precious as mine because it doesn't say Notre-Dame de Lourdes. But this is, they said, you know, it will save you. And
I'm glad you were able to share that with us.
Yeah.
I know there's so much to tell, and we're going to not have time for everything, but I think let's go back a little bit and just briefly tell us about the letter that your mother got from her mother.
Yeah, my grandmother in Hamburg, my father had tried to get her out, but she already walked with a cane and had arthritis. And she said, nothing will happen to me. And then in 41, in November 41, in the summer of 41, her apartment was taken over. She was put in what's called a Judenhaus, a Jew house, if you want. And it was a miserable little place. And she got a letter saying that she had to report the next morning. And she already knew that was go east to Auschwitz, or one of the camps. And all her friends were disappearing one by one, and she knew it was the end. So she took an overdose of Veronal, an overdose of sleeping pill, and she committed suicide.
And she wrote this to your mom.
Yes, and she wrote a letter. She didn't use the word. I have a copy of that letter. It's in my book. And she said farewell. I can extrapolate a little bit about that. I'm pretty sure that this is when my mother got cyanide for us, because my mother told us, my sister and me, don't worry, if the Germans come to get us, I'll give you a little pill, you will die right away and you will never suffer. Now, I know if there are some young parents here, they think it's impossible to do that. But my sister and I, we took it for granted. So we'll die and we won't suffer. And that was the most important thing, not to suffer.
And and through the duration of the war, your mother had those?
Yes, she had those. And the whole village, where later on you'll see where we were in hiding, the whole village, maybe the Mendels family will commit suicide. Yeah.
Through all of that, you found yourself getting to this little village of Logat.
Yeah, not exactly right away.
Not right away. So tell us a little bit about actually getting there, because that had all kinds of risks for you. You're now in what's called the unoccupied zone of France.
So-called unoccupied zone, yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah, so we left that morning after that wonderful family had housed us that night, and my little friend Cécile, who just died, I remember sharing a bed with her. And the two boys in that family, Michel Paris, he was 15 years old, and his friend Michel Deneuve, who lived upstairs from us in Saint-Mandé, they my parents put their life belongings in a backpack, imagine. And they bought the tickets, because Jews, of course, were not allowed. You needed a visa, you needed an Ausweis in German, and Jews were not allowed any of that. And so they got all that for us. They met us at the train station, La Gare d'Austerlitz, the station going south, and they gave us my parents' backpack. My sister and I didn't have anything. And we got on the train. We had each other. And we got on the train, and the train wouldn't leave, and my father, and I remember that. My father became frantic, and he went to the head of that wagon, that particular train, to see what's going on. And there was a woman there, said, "Oh, they are rounding up Jews on the other side of the tracks." So you can imagine how my parents felt.
And you're sitting there on that train.
Yes, about to leave. And finally, they had their quota of Jews that morning, probably, and the train left slowly. And then we had to change trains in Angoulême, which is not a big city, and my sister fell. And to this day, my sister says that she feels, she didn't have a concussion, but she hurt her back. And another miracle, because if we had to go to a hospital, they would have seen Juif on my parents' paper, and that would have been the end. But she said it's okay. And we got to the little country train, and we were meeting supposedly those two passeurs, those two smugglers, but they came to get us at the train and said, "We can't take you." Why? I don't know. We had to check into a hotel, which we did. And the next morning, it was hot, you know. It was the 31st of July or 1st of June. It can be very hot in France. And I remember we had to walk 10 kilometers, that's 6 miles. And for little legs, that was a lot.
Distance.
I remember resting under a tree, actually. And then we were supposed to meet the smugglers, and they showed up. They were not always honest, but our smugglers were very honest. At midnight, in the cemetery behind the church, at midnight. And we did, and they were there. And they came with 2 bicycles. They were, I wish I would be able to find out what happened to those 2 young men. They were very honest. And I should do some research here at the museum, actually. One was the son of a farmer, and the other one was the son of a baker. And we started walking, and at one time, and you know, the Germans were there, and we were there. I remember seeing the cigarette butts right there. And one of them said, "Well, go down on your knees." And which we did. It was summer, but it was wet in the middle of the night. And my sister said at that time, "I have to do pee-pee." And it sounds funny, but it could have been tragic.
Absolutely.
Because if they heard that would have been the end of us. Mm-hmm. And also my parents carried a ring. My father was able to get some gold ring, and you know, in French, you have the thing in English too, la bourse ou la vie, your money or your life, or your gold or your life. I don't know how
Money
you
or
say.
your life.
Yeah. And my parents were hoping that they would give their ring, and I have that ring, I'm not wearing it today, and that we would have our life. And then we managed to cross the demarcation line. My sister and I were on one bicycle. The other cyclist was ahead, and he had a whistling signal with my father saying, everything is clear. And so we were able to cross the demarcation line in the so-called free zone. And there was a contingent of soldiers accepted by Vichy, by Hitler and Pétain, and they took us to the barracks. But the next morning, the commandant, the head, said, we can't keep you. And they took us under escort to a town called Ribérac in Dordogne, where we were. And we checked into a hotel. My parents didn't know anybody. And we were very tired. And knock at the door, police. My parents were under arrest. And they were interrogated. I found that all in the archives later on. They had to say that they were of the Jewish race, that they left Paris because it was too dangerous, that they were honest people, etc. 15 minutes for my father, and he said he had 4,000 francs or something. And then my mother, 15 minutes, the same thing. She said she had 4,000 francs with her, and that she was, but something really interesting, she said she was born in Hamburg, Germany, and if the police, the French police, had been smart, they would have said, oh, a German Jew, and they should have shipped her directly to a camp in Gurs or in the south of France where they put all German Jews, and they didn't. They were not smart enough, lucky for us. She was naturalized Dutch by marriage, so my parents. And so then we were under escort sent to Périgueux, which is the headquarters of that department of Dordogne. And there we were my parents were under arrest again. And for a whole month, they had to report every day. We were in a little hotel. We were eating in a soup kitchen. I remember a long table, but I don't remember being hungry. But we had food, like homeless people here, And at the end of the month, there was a man, it's called the préfet, the man in charge of that area, Dordogne and some other areas, that had the right of life or death on us. And that was one of the Pétain laws. And so he could put us in a camp, and France had a lot of camps. Not death camps, but concentration camps, or to go and get lost. And that's what he was, a good man. I think I found out his name was Rivière or something. And he said, go get lost in the country. And my parents found that tiny, tiny village called Le Got, and where there were 30 houses, and we had 2 rooms upstairs. No water, no toilet, no electricity, no nothing. And my sister and I went to get water at the pump, and once a week we could wash in a tub, one after the other. And that's where we spent 29 months. 29
months. And I want you to tell us about that time, but let's start with, in August 1943, your mother gave birth to your brother, Franklin. And that was, under the circumstances, clearly a very difficult time. Tell us a little about his birth and what it meant for your parents and for you in this little village of Logat.
Yeah, my mother became pregnant. Actually, 2 months after we arrived, more or less, because my brother was born in August 43. We had arrived in October 42. And all of France was occupied, by the way. November 11, the armistice, Hitler decided, because the Americans had invaded North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, he was so furious. Okay, so we're occupying all of France. So the Germans were all over.
So German soldiers were everywhere
in
now.
our village too. Yep. They were all over. Actually, I won't have time to tell, but the Gestapo came actually because the young man downstairs had been denounced, and so there were 5 Gestapo cars, and they didn't go upstairs because he was good enough not to say, don't kill me, but go upstairs, there's a Jewish family. He was tortured for 3 weeks in Limoges. but he never said anything. Anyway, my mother was pregnant. She was very sick. And, you know, we didn't have doctors or anything. She spent 9 months. And I have little notes that were kept by my parents. And I was telling my mother, I hope you will feel better tomorrow. She had a terrible, terrible time. I remember once she did go to Villefranche, the next village where we were allowed to go, also more or less 10 kilometers. And I was pushing, and my sister, we were pushing her up the hill. She was wearing a nightgown. You know, she didn't have pregnancy clothes, of course. She was wearing a nightgown, and then we were pushing her. I don't know if it was a doctor or a dentist. Anyway, the time came when she was supposed to give birth. And there was a woman that was supposed to help with the birth in sage-femme. What do you say that in English?
Like a midwife?
What?
Midwife?
A midwife.
Midwife, yeah.
And, but the baby was in a bridge position, and my mother was bleeding, and she had to be transported, which was strictly forbidden. The midwife said there is a hospital, but it's in another department called Lot-et-Garonne, where she was not allowed to go. But it was the middle of the night, and the man downstairs, who actually worked for the Germans, took his car or his little van and took my mother, who was bleeding to death, and with my father, and they made it to that hospital, which was in the back of a chateau, le Chateau Salomon, le Chateau Bosclat, where there was daylight. And on one side, the doctor, Dr. Bouquet, that we saw 20 years ago, was treating German soldiers because they had something too happening to them. And on the other side was a Jewish woman who was about to die. And my mother had a rare blood type, which I have 2 AB+, and to find blood was, I don't know.
In wartime.
Yes. You know, they didn't have blood banks in those days, you can imagine. But my mother survived, and my brother was born. And my parents named him Franklin. Does anybody know why Franklin, which in French is Franklin? Huh?
For Roosevelt.
Because the only hope of survival for my parents was Roosevelt at that time. They didn't have news, they didn't have radio, but they had heard before we fled that Franklin Roosevelt might help. Actually, we know now that Franklin Roosevelt didn't do much. But if the baby had been a girl, they were going to call her Marianne, because Marianne is the symbol of France. Mm-hmm. And so it was a boy, so it was Franklin. And they even had him circumcised, which was very dangerous, because that named a Jewish boy. My mother, of course, couldn't breastfeed, and I don't know, there was nobody, and the milk didn't agree, he almost died. I don't know if you saw a photo there. My brother was crying, and the nurse in the hospital said, "Oh, what a bad baby." Just cow's milk didn't agree with him. I don't know if they knew about boiling milk or anything, but we got, after 3 weeks, my mother was able to travel, and under I don't know what circumstances, and came back. In the meantime, my sister and I were taken care of by a Spanish refugee from the Spanish Civil War, and many Spanish refugees had moved to the south of France. And I remember the boy there, he taught me how to play marbles. That's what I remember. And that was a big deal. You know, we had no toys, we had nothing. But he had marbles, and so he helped Manuela and me to play marbles. And my mother came. And then, miracle of miracles, as you know now from what I wrote, my father discovered sweet concentrated milk, and which still exists these days, the Nestle sweet, yeah.
Milk. Mm-hmm.
And my mother was able to dilute that. My sister and I had to go get water, of course, and then when that tin was empty, I licked the bottom. It tasted so good. You know, we didn't have much food. We had chestnuts. That's what we survived on, and so that little bit of I remember to this day how good it was.
The taste of that. Jacqueline, you would remain in, as you mentioned earlier, you remained in Legut for 29 months, more than 2 years. And during that time, you were not denounced. How did your family manage to survive during that time and to not be denounced now that all of France is occupied? Nazis and the Gestapo are everywhere.
It was the law to denounce Jews,
It was
actually.
the law to denounce Jews, and there you are.
Well, they were wonderful people. They were very poor. They were farmers. Once in a while, well, my father was in hiding most of the time in an underground, in a cellar or in the woods. And I have to say that the mayor of Legot, Mazerolles, that double village, his name was Paul Delpech. I was able 2 years ago to have him declared righteous among the nations because he saved our lives. And there was one other Jewish family that he kept. He was a farmer, and he had a tiny, tiny room that was his, and he helped the resistants, the underground people as well. But whenever something was happening, he told us, and we went into the woods, the whole family. I remember we went into a chicken coop once, but it must have been summer because I don't remember being cold. But he warned us every time. One time, the situation was so desperate, my parents wanted to put my sister and me in a convent. I don't think, maybe it was before I don't know if it was before or after. In Montpazier, which is a town not far away from Belvès and all those little towns there. And there was a convent. And my sister and I were actually happy. We prepared a little bag with things. And then the mayor came and said, you can't do that because the Germans are traveling through that road. And we never went. And it's a good thing we didn't go because then that convent was raided and they would have found 2 Jewish girls. Right. And that would have been the end of us. So there were so many miracles like that. It's unbelievable.
And the mayor, I think he provided you with a family with false papers.
Yes, yeah. Except once a week we could go to Villefranche on Saturday only, and by foot or by bicycle, to get food or to get something or to go to the doctor. I should say that the whole time we were not sick. It's another miracle, you know. We never needed a dentist or a doctor like children need usually, and except my mother's pregnancy, of course. But
that is amazing. You're young children and
yeah.
no sickness
yeah.
or anything.
Right, yeah. But no, the mayor was absolutely wonderful, and he got those papers for us, but it said Juif. And I remember asking the archivist in Périgueux 20 years ago when I went, and he said, well, you know, you were declared. Sarlat, which is a town in Dordogne, knew the Mendels family was there, and they were a Jewish family. They could come any day to get us. So in order to get tickets for buying flour, or I don't think there was oil, or a few things, we needed those cards. Right. But it said Juif. And then the mayor got false papers from my parents, which I think they never used. I remember seeing a drawer there where those papers were with false names, the right version. And also there was a tablet of chocolate that my mother kept. And I remember that, I think I wrote it in my book. And when my mother finally opened the tablet, it was full of worms. And she had to throw it away. So goes for the chocolate, and we were looking forward to having. We had hardly any food, you know. We had chestnuts, and we had and walnuts.
And that's what you lived on, mostly, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, there was a baker, and with our ticket, we could get bread once in a while. And I remember when we were on our way to hiding in the forest, we stopped at that wonderful family called Lamoureux, and she did something that my sister forgot, but I remember. She did the cross, the Catholic cross, and then turned the bread over and then sliced it. And I guess that was a custom. There are many customs in that part of the south of France that Some people know. My French friends probably know about that. And then we went into the woods, and they found an ancient baby carriage for my brother, and all of us were there. Yeah.
Well, incredibly, and you can't possibly do justice to describing it, but to think that you are living openly but with hidden identities in a little village where it's the law to denounce Jews. The villagers had to know you were Jewish.
No.
You don't think they knew?
I don't think they knew what a Jew was. They knew we were refugees.
You were refugees.
We were coming from Paris. And I remember in Paris, my sister and I were a well-educated little girl, and we did what's called la révérence. When we said hello to a friend of my parents, we bent down, and my mother said, "Don't do that in the country." So we didn't do la révérence. How do you say that in English? I don't know.
I don't know.
Well, anyway, but what I want to say is that those farmers, they were all farmers, they struggled. They were what we call in French the real républicains. They were for the republic. They were, and so many had lost somebody in the First World War. They hated the Germans, you know, and there were some prisoners of war. I remember my little friend, Jeannot Martegut, who is, where I told him about the poison and that we would die, and his father was a prisoner of war.
Of the Germans.
Yes, yes. It was called the STO, le Service de Travail Obligatoire. Of course, for the Jews, once they said all men have to report, and my father, instead of the STO, would have been shipped to the gas chambers. And he didn't go that night, and he says he thanked his lucky star that he disobeyed, actually. But no, the mayor was marvelous, and the farmers, you know, les paysans, the farmers were struggling themselves. The underground people came to the village and raided what if there were some eggs or something, because they needed to be fed too. And then the Germans came and they took everything. They took all the animals, they took everything. So it was tough for them. It was very tough. I think once in a while they give us eggs too.
So after all that time, in August 1944, soon after the Normandy invasion, Paris was liberated by the Allies in August of 1944.
Not right away, you know, the Germans were there in the south,
Right.
and the Bremer company, or whatever it's called, went up, and it was so dangerous. They went through all the villages. I remember that they were crossing our little street there, and I was curious, as I always am, and I looked, and my mother said, "Go down," because they could have shot me right there and then. And they went to a village called Oradour-sur-Glane, and my father always meant very close to where, and they put all the men against the wall. They shot them all. They put all the women and children in the church, and they burned the church. And to this day, Oradour-sur-Glane is a memorial. It has never been rebuilt.
It's still the ruins
Yes.
as they were left, yeah.
Right, exactly.
So once Paris was liberated in August of 1944, your father pretty quickly made his way back to Paris and then came back to get the family later.
In November 44.
In November. Tell us, well, first tell us about your father hearing about the Normandy invasion.
Yeah, my father was out of his hiding place, which was underground in a dilapidated old house from one of the farmers, a wonderful farmer. He was out because it was June. As most people know, that June 44 was le débarquement, what you call D-Day, and he was picking cherries. That was food, you know, for us. And when he heard the news, he fell from the tree, but he didn't get hurt, and he came home. But that was not, of course, the end of the war, but it was the beginning of a little bit of joy.
What prompted him at that moment then to head for Paris?
He felt that he wanted to know what happened to his business. He wanted to know what happened to our apartment, which had been, he didn't know that, but our apartment was occupied by German soldiers, the whole war, and all the furniture, everything had disappeared. And when he got to Paris, the concierge told him, go to the city hall and see. And my father found the bed here and the thing there, and he was able to barely furnish our apartment, which was, and my parents' bed was there, and it was slit open, and they were looking. They thought my parents had hidden money, but there was nothing except a slit mattress. And so my father claimed our apartment, which was very wise because the refugees that were coming back, first come, first served, they would have taken our apartment. Right. And I know of people who came back and their apartment had been taken by other refugees, but our apartment was there.
And your father's, by getting there so quickly, he was able to really reclaim that.
Right.
So he came back and got you and the family in November, and you returned to Paris. So that's November of 1944. You're back in Paris. You're trying to resume life as best you can. But of course, the war is still going on till April of 1945. Do you think your parents were worried that the Germans might come back, that the victories might be reversed, and that there were still threats because the war was underway?
You know, I can't answer that question. I don't think you asked me that question. My parents were mostly concerned. My mother knew that her mother had committed suicide, but my father said, we survived, so surely my mother, my brother, my sister, my father had a large family that they were in hiding and survived too. And little by little, my father went to the Red Cross and found out actually his mother was murdered in Sobibor in March 43. And my father had written he was so hoping to introduce his son to his mother, but she was long gone. And my father's brother, sister, cousins, everybody. Well, later on we found out, and my niece did a lot of research, that 200 members of our extended family were murdered. Everybody was murdered, except my two cousins that were in hiding in Holland.
Except for the two cousins.
Yeah.
We have time to turn to our audience for a few questions, but before we do, I want to ask you one more, Jacqueline. You left France in 1957 to come to the United States and marry Richard. Was it hard for your family, after all you'd been through, for you to
Very
move?
hard,
Mm-hmm.
very hard. We were the five of us with my brother, and we were so tightly. We had no family. My little friends went on Sunday to their grandmother. They went on vacation to their cousin. We had no one.
Had no one.
We had us. And for
No
my parents,
aunts, no
it
uncles,
was
no grandparents.
nobody. When my parents wanted to keep us tight together. And so when I fell in love with Richard and he asked me to marry him, it was very hard. It was an ordeal for them.
And your sister also eventually came to the United
Yes.
States. Did your parents come here?
Yes, they came to San Francisco and they spent 10 years there, I think. 10 years, and then they went back to
Then
France.
went back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I know there's so much more for us to talk about, but let's turn to our audience for a couple
Let
of
me
questions.
tell you one thing,
Okay.
is that
Absolutely.
since all my family died, there is something, it's called Stolperstein, and I was able to, through a German man, very nice man, Mr. Demning, to put some, I don't know if it's bronze or brick, in front of the last residence. And there is in The Hague, the last residence of my grandmother, where it says murdered in Sobibor, and my uncle murdered in Auschwitz, and his wife murdered in Auschwitz. And that's on the ground in The Hague, in front of the former apartment house.
And you were able to go and
Yes.
place that, weren't
Yeah,
you?
I didn't go personally, but my cousins that survived are forever thankful to me for being able. It was a big deal to get permission,
Mm-hmm.
but, so that was done.
And there's now many thousands of those Stolpersteins.
Yes, in Berlin mostly.
Berlin,
yeah. but in Holland also. Yeah.
Okay, let's see if our audience, I think we have time for a couple of questions. We have microphones in each of the aisle. We're going to ask that you wait till you have the microphone in your hand. Make your question, if you can, as brief as you can, and then I'll repeat it just to make sure that we hear it before Jacqueline responds. And I see we have one right over here.
Good morning. As a course leader tour guide, my group was disappointed not to be able to go upstairs because we didn't have a reservation. But I want to say to you, we are so gratified to be able to come in here, my students here, and hear someone relate the experiences that she had. I think your story, as you have related it to us, is so fascinating that even though they didn't go upstairs, they have a first-hand account of what happened, and I'm confident it will stick with them for the rest of their lives. And I just want to thank you for being available. And I don't use the word enjoy anytime I come here. I ask them what they learned, what they are inspired by, so that it will be never again. Thank you.
Jacqueline, were you able to hear all of that?
That he's grateful.
He's here with his group of students, and they couldn't get into the permanent exhibition today, but how wonderful it was to have the opportunity to hear your firsthand account, and that will help make sure that this never happens again, and that's what these students will take away with them. Thank you for that. Very kind remarks. Thank you. Okay. Oh, there we go. Right in the middle, I think.
Hello.
Hello.
I was wondering, have you seen a personal friend of yours been captured and sent to the Holocaust?
The question is if you saw somebody personally taken away to go during the Holocaust, but I think this really gets to the fact that you had not only so many family members that were deported and were murdered in death camps, but also many other neighbors, children, and many others that you lived with in Paris. Many others lost their lives and were murdered. I think that's probably what we're getting at here. Yeah.
What I'm,
okay.
I saw. I went back to Paris many times, and I saw those people that housed us the last night before we escaped. And when I came back to Paris, I was 9 years old, and so those people were still there. Those neighbors, and some of them were absolutely wonderful people. They suffered because they didn't have food with the Germans' occupation, but they didn't suffer like we did, of course, and yeah.
All right, well, thank you. And then let's go with one more question, and then I think it's time for us to close.
You talked about many different people who helped you survive this time, and people who risked their lives to save your lives and those of your family. Was there a quality or characteristic that you felt those people all shared that we might learn from their deeds that was very heroic?
He's making the point that there were a number of people that you mentioned that helped you, helped save you during that whole time, some risking their lives doing that.
Yeah.
And he's asking, could you see a characteristic or quality in them that maybe they had in common that enabled them to take those risks and those good actions?
It's difficult to answer your question. What I want to say is that I am a speaker here at the Holocaust Museum. I speak to a lot of people, younger and older, and my final words are always try and do some good. We see the planet these days that is full of horrible events, and I tell people, you can help a blind person cross the street. You don't have to become a doctor without borders, or you have young people that are going to choose a profession. The principal thing is to try and to make the planet a better place. And I think it's very difficult these days because our planet, I must say, is when I read the papers sometimes, or every day actually, our planet is becoming rotten, so we're going to have to either improve it or choose another planet. That's what I say to young people.
Thank you for that really fine question. We're going to close in just a moment. I ask you to stay with us for just a couple of moments more. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person gets the last word. So I'm going to turn back to Jacqueline to close our program in just a moment. When Jacqueline is done, we're going to try to get her up the stairs as quickly as we can. Actually going to go up the elevator outside this door, because she's going to go to the top of the stairs out in the foyer where she will sign copies of her memoir. And if you have the opportunity to talk with Jacqueline, then that would be great. I want to thank all of you for being with us. Remind you that we have a first-person program each Wednesday and Thursday through the middle of August. So, perhaps you can come back and join us this year, and if not, maybe in a future year. We hope you can come back. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Jacqueline to close us out for today.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I wanted to say is the situation was so desperate, and my book, if you see it upstairs later on, is entitled "À dimanche prochain," which means until next Sunday, because my parents were so desperate, and they say that they wished to be alive one more week until the next Sunday. And my sister and I took it for granted. And I just hope that it will never happen to you in your lives, whether you are young or not so young, that it will happen that you are in a desperate situation and that you want to survive. So I hope that you live in a better world, actually, and that there won't be those terrible events like in Rwanda, in the Sudan, in Serbia, in Syria right now. Those things have to come to an end, and maybe you can do something about it to improve the planet. Those are my words.